humbly honored and with a bit of trepidation to be your speaker for the 2016 Eleanor Chelimsky Forum. You've already heard from a few luminaries in the field of evaluation, and I only hope that what I share with you this morning will be comparable interest to you. It will probably take a little bit of a different twist about persistent problems in evaluation, and that is our articulation and teaching of its history, and that has implications for both evaluation theory and practice. I first came in contact with Eleanor Chelimsky's work during my doctoral studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the early 1980s. At that time, I, along with Hallie Preskel, Sandra Matheson, Linda Mabry, Catherine Ryan, and Rosalie Torres, and a few others of us were doc students being taught, challenged, and occasionally feeling a bit more than a bit intimidated by the faculty that include the likes of Tom Hastings, Bob Stake, Ernie House, Terry Denny, and Gordon Hoke, not to mention the other visitors who could bring comparable levels of intimidation when they passed through the halls, such as Michael Scriven, Lee Cronbach, Dan Stuffelbeam, and even Ralph Tyler, just to name a few of the people who would roam the halls at the Center for Instructional Resources and Curriculum Evaluation, and would also wreak a certain amount of intimidation when you see them coming and you start to try to get out the way and hope they didn't ask you anything as you were going by. At this center that was in fact founded by Tom Hastings and Lee Cronbach in the 1960s. Subsequently, I have had occasional drive-by readings for one reason or another of Eleanor's work. Therefore, I've enjoyed the opportunity to do a bit of catching up and reminder readings of her work that has contributed so much to our thinking and practice of evaluation. At the same time, my remarks today come at a time of personal and professional reflection over the past couple of years. I was finally able to relieve myself of some major university administrative responsibilities, allowing me to devote more substantive time to career, my scholarly work, and my students. This has also been conducive for me to spend some quality time and have the privilege of working closely with my longtime friends and colleagues, Rodney Hobson and Karen Kirkhart, who have also been sources of inspiration for me as well. We have, over the last couple of years, we have worked on several writing projects, some conferences, professional training projects. They have once again pushed me, my thinking, provided a bit of clarity and possible next steps in our respective and collective work. I'm supposed to change now. Which one? Did that do it? Yeah. All right.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, okay. Okay. And I have no idea which button I pushed to make that right.
Yeah, you want me to do it for you?
Yeah, can you? Yeah, thank you. All right. This particular occasion has prompted me to provide the next installment in our Nobody Knows My Name project to acquaint you with the predecessor of Eleanor Chelimsky in the federal government, Ambrose Calibre. I strongly believe he also made a significant contribution in the history of evaluation nearly 3 decades earlier, particularly in educational evaluation and more specifically within the context of the education of African Americans. Calibre's trailblazing work was multidimensional in view of the time. As a professional federal employee in the Office of Education in the U.S. Department of Interior during the period of 1930 to 1962. Eleanor Chelimsky's trailblazing role was also multidimensional during the period of 1966 to 1994, but for some of us it is what she accomplished in the U.S. General Accounting Office between 1980 and 1994 and during this period that has left an imprint in the history of U.S. evaluation. At the same time, she has also alerted us to the transformations in evaluation that we are wrestling with today. Though both Chelimsky and Calibre made their indelible imprints in the federal government at very different times in our history, in very different branches of the federal government, and in very different social, political, and economic contexts, they were in fact unflinching in their efforts to speak truth to power in their work. I'm actually hoping that this presentation will grow up to be a decent manuscript one day and ready for some broader scholarly consumption somewhere. However, for me, my thinking and preparation for this presentation is to take yet one more step in our collective effort to trace our roots as African American evaluators. At the same time, this work is also intended to hopefully enlighten those who did not know or possibly had ignored that this legacy existed. We further hope that others recognize and act to rectify the exclusion of evaluators of color as we teach the history of evaluation in the U.S. Okay, hit it, Nick.
Yeah, I got you.
Cool. The evaluation literature is rich with numerous views about the periods and generations and phases in the historical evolution of what we call evaluation. Of course, the lenses used have been slightly different depending on who you read, but with some distinct commonalities as well. As a creature of habit, I have typically used these two portrayals in my introductory evaluation courses. One thing I emphasize in this particular lecture is that even though our focus is on evaluation, we must always be cognizant of what else was going on in our society and history at that time. Evaluation does not operate in a vacuum. Calibre's work was clearly and profoundly influenced by the Depression, World War II, racial segregation, systemic disenfranchisement, and racial violence. Chelimsky similarly engaged in her trailblazing work during the period of Vietnam, Woodstock, campus unrest, the radicalized 1970s, the Black Power movement, Watergate, Title IX, and the Equal Rights Amendment. I would be challenged not to believe that in some way, evaluation theory, research, and practice were not influenced by these significant contextual factors, or at least in my mind, should have influenced, or at least informed evaluation theory and practice at that time. Okay, Nick. I have often puzzled as to why Medallion and stuff are being viewed the post-World War II era of 1946 to 1957 as the Age of Innocence. In some ways, we see the tools of evaluation growing through the massive data being collected on schooling and technology such as machine scoring of standardized tests, accompanied by the founding of Educational Testing Service in 1947, with fingerprints of Ralph Tyler and Cronbach, just to mention a couple, who were also iconic in their contributions to evaluation history, theory, and practice. For me, this period also seems to reflect a period of avoidance in the young U.S. evaluation community, seemingly avoiding to substantively address issues of segregation, racial discrimination, racial violence, and the innumerable social and educational problems. As far as I can tell, the broader evaluation community was collectively silent, at least as far as I've been able to see, and I would like to be persuaded otherwise. Okay, Nick. It should not be a surprise that Marvin Alkin's 2004 book, Evaluation Roots, Tracing Theorists' Views and Influences, was a topic of discussion with Rodney Hobson and I about our Nobody Knows My Name project. However, the context of this particular conversation was also a bit more intense, as we were in the midst of writing our installment on Reedy Jackson as a chapter in our 2005 edited book. Reedy Jackson received his PhD from Ohio State University in 1938, and in fact was one of the most prolific African-American evaluation scholars during the pre-Brown era, who was identified in our project, serving much of his time on the faculty of Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Okay. 2004 was the year of the 60th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, with AEA being held in Atlanta, the home of Dr. King, and the home of several iconic historically black colleges and universities. So I'm sure.
Oh, he's on this one.
Okay.
Switch your slide, sorry.
Okay. See, my yen went the other way there. Okay. So I'm sure that no one here would be surprised that we made the connection between Alkin's evaluation roots to Alex Haley's book, Roots, the saga of an American family in 1974, and the hugely successful made-for-TV miniseries Roots. The Next Generation in 1979 that captured America's attention. Haley's work stimulated a rush of genealogical activity within the African American community and very likely contributed to similar activity in the other communities. The Nobody Knows My Name project evolved from what I had initially titled Evaluation Roots, tracing the contributions of African Americans in the early history of evaluation. However, the title from James Baldwin's 1961 collection of essays under the title, Nobody Knows My Name, More Notes of a Native Son in 1961, seemed to be a bit more fitting to what I had felt after being told that there were no African-American evaluators during this period, or simply that no one knew of any. We have undertaken this project to discover and acknowledge our roots in the field of evaluation by illuminating the untold contributions of African-American education researchers and evaluators to the field of evaluation research in the United States during the pre-Brown era. We are retrieving from near obscurity the work of early contributors and pioneering African-American scholars who have been excluded from what is taught as the history of educational evaluation research in the U.S. Our quest to revisit, illuminate, and verify our roots as African-American evaluators is professionally and personally important to us, as is claiming this heritage for the benefit of others to come. As I looked at the illustration of Alkin's 2004 evaluation tree, I had no disagreement with its two roots, one root of accountability and control, with the other being social inquiry. I also saw the three branches of use, methods, and valuing as being reasonable. Of course, what stood out to me was Chin being the only evaluator of color on this tree. As I looked at this evaluation tree and its branches, I could not help but think that there were other mighty trees in this evaluation forest that were hidden from view, or at least outside the view of the illustrator. Even though Alkin made a few adjustments in his tree by revising the accountability and control root to social accountability, adding an epistemology root and a couple more women, including Chelimsky, Mertens and Wilson in 2012 had taken what I consider to be the first assertive step to include this history with their social justice branch and the names of other evaluators of color in their evaluation textbook, Program Evaluation Theory and Practice. Rodney, Karen, and I have also recently added a bit more to this conversation in our recent chapter in the Newcomer et al. Handbook on Practical Program Evaluation. All right. Prior to 1930, there had been little or no comprehensive description of African American education. Therefore, African American scholars were compelled to describe the present status of education for African Americans. The explanation as to why the disparities existed between African Americans and whites was simply racism and its legal sanctioning of segregation due to Plessy versus Ferguson. Ultimately, they sought to provide compelling evidence to hold America, and particularly the southern states, accountable by providing comprehensive and irrefutable evidence of these disparities through the African American experience in the American educational system. Two crucial historical events significantly influenced and heightened the professional awareness of African Americans in their quest to study and respond to educational inequities. They used evaluative inquiry as the vehicle to carry their message of social responsibility to other African Americans, and to a much lesser degree to the evaluation community at large. The first was the appointment of Ambrose Calibre as the specialist in the education of Negroes in the U.S. Office of Education's Division of Special Problems in 1930, and the founding of Howard University's Journal of Negro Education in 1932 by Charles H. Thompson. These two historical forces combined to give voice and credibility to the evaluation and educational research efforts of an increasing number of African American scholars in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. The 1930s, in fact, marked a critical period in the substantive educational research and evaluation on African Americans by African Americans, as well as the initial legal strategy by the NAACP to dismantle the legitimacy of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Prior to this time, the extent of high-quality educational research and by African American scholars to investigate the experiences of African Americans within the American educational system was suppressed by the absence of doctoral trained African Americans and the availability of credible disaggregated education data, largely due to the resistance of the states to provide these data to African Americans. In a number of ways, the 1930s initiated the efforts by African American scholarly community and legal community to describe, explain, and to hold the federal, state, and local governments accountable for their unfair and unequal treatment of the African American community in every sector of their lives. It was during the decade of the 1930s that the carefully planned NAACP's legal action to challenge Plessy began to take shape. The NAACP determined that the place to confront the inequalities to segregated schools was by challenging the separate but equal doctrine. The plan was to force the equalization of expenditures between white and African American schools. Thurgood Marshall believed that the best strategy for challenging segregation in graduate and professional schools was to seek, and I quote, the absolute equalization and complete equalization of curricula, faculty, and physical equipment of white and black schools on the theory that the extreme cost of maintaining two equal systems could eventually destroy segregation. This legal strategy was not based on the belief that the separate but equal doctrine would be dismantled immediately, but rather it would wither from persistent demonstration of its total illogic. It was also probable that the complexity of the separate public school system and the access to disaggregated data from the southern states would present major barriers in building the cases to be argued before the courts. The absence of these data and the necessity for them to be critically analyzed can be viewed as the major impetus for the efforts by Ambrose Calibre and Charles Thompson. Okay, hit it. In 1932, Charles Thompson, being the first member of the first community of African Americans with doctors in education, and you will see that he received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1925. He published the first issue of the journal Negro Education as its founding editor. First among the four reasons that Thompson articulated for establishing J&E was the total absence of general means for collecting and disseminating facts about activities among Negroes. At the time, there were very limited or no quantitative data available from any governmental or private entity that could provide a meaningful description of the conditions of education of African Americans, nor a vehicle to disseminate it, even if it were in fact available. The second reason was for a continuous critical appraisal and discussion of the present and proposed practices relating to the education of Negroes. In this particular second reason for establishing J&E, that one can surmise that the journal would be a vehicle for disseminating evaluative inquiries about the education of African Americans for the purpose of judging the quality of educational curriculum, pedagogy, and programs. The third reason was that there was also a need for scholarly publication to stimulate, sponsor investigation of problems incident to the education of Negroes. This third reason clearly speaks to the need for the stimulation and sponsorship of empirical studies on the education of African Americans. The final and probably the most obvious reason was that there were no journals dedicated to a critical examination of the education of African Americans. There was no equivocation on the part of Thompson that the white educational journals, such as the Journal of the National Education Association or the Journal of Educational Research, could or would serve as vehicles for the types of discussion necessary to seriously address concerns facing the education of African Americans. African American education researchers and evaluators could not expect that other journals for Negroes, such as the Civil Rights Journals Crisis and Opportunity and the Journal of Negro History, would be expanded to meet their needs. The J&E issues of the 1930s would fulfill the void in education, in the educational literature on educational research and evaluation pertaining to the education of African Americans. Most significantly, the void was filled by African American education researchers and evaluators. Thompson and his editor's note in the inaugural issue of J&E in 1932 stated, and I quote, "There is a need for continuous critical appraisal and discussion of the present and proposed practices related to the education of Negroes. It is obvious that the mere collection of facts is only the first step in developing an understanding upon which to base the same direction of any movement or institution. It can be truthfully said that proposals affecting the education of Negroes have not been subjected to an abundance of critical investigation and thinking." Next one. The other way.
My bad.
Yeah, there you go. Ambrose Calibre was born in 1894 in Saltsville, Virginia. He had two siblings but was raised by his aunt, but there is very little information known about his parents. And I'll just take a quick sidestep real quick. You're going to see some photos. We've been in the Howard University archives and Ambrose Calibre's papers where they're housed at for several times. So Rodney and I were just there a couple of times, a couple of weeks ago actually. So you get a chance for the first time to see some of these pictures that we unearthed while we were there, okay? All right, hit the next one. Daniel and Holden in their work in 1966 provide what I found to be the only fairly comprehensive biography of Calibre. He received his BA in 1915 from Knoxville College in Tennessee. After serving as a high school teacher and a principal, he was hired in 1917 by the private liberal arts college, Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, to in fact implement his vocational education program. Calibre rose through various positions at Fisk and earned an MA from the University of Wisconsin in 1920. He was then named as the Dean of Fisk in 1927, who was the first African American to hold this position, and served for 2 years before taking a leave of absence to complete his doctoral studies, being confirmed his PhD from Columbia Teachers College in 1930 at the age of 37, and was the 8th African American to receive a doctorate in education. Upon completion of his doctorate, rather than accepting the faculty position he had been offered at Howard University, Calibre accepted a newly created position in the Department of Interior's U.S. Office of Education, making him the first African American to hold a classified professional position in the federal government. The public functions of this newly created position were, first, to serve as a clearinghouse of information concerning Negro education. Second, to conduct, direct, and encourage educational research. Third, to stimulate interest in the present status and future possibilities of Negro education. Calibre would also be expected to focus on the problem of Negro education, all of the expert knowledge, techniques, and educational forces that were available. Calibre's position as the specialist in education of Negroes was largely undefined and created mostly as a politically motivated morsel for emerging concerns about the Negro problem, as they called it, in education. Calibre was a member of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. President Roosevelt had appointed an unprecedented number of African Americans to high positions. By 1935, 45 had positions in cabinet offices and New Deal agencies. In 1936, this group began calling itself the Federal Council on Negro Affairs. Although these leaders were not officially cabinet members, their role in advising the president on black employment, education, and civil rights issues led the press to refer to them as FDR's Black Cabinet or the Black Brain Trust. Among them were Mary McLeod Bethune, director of the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, William H. Hastings, assistant solicitor in the Department of Interior, and Robert C. Weaver, who served as a special assistant to the administrator of the U.S. Housing Authority. Now, no doubt, Mary McLeod Bethune was as being the founder of a private HBCU in Daytona Beach, Florida in 1904, was the undisputed most influential member of the cabinet, probably significantly due to her close relationship and friendship to the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Ambrose Calibre produced bibliographies on Negro education, prepared bulletins on selected phases covering the education of Negroes, and authored monographs on the Negro based on surveys of pressing national problems. By 1945, his office reported he had published 19 bulletins, 10 leaflets, pamphlets of mimeograph circulars, and 36 articles on critical issues of African American education. Okay. Calibre authored what can be viewed as some of the most critically important publications on African American education during the 1930s that included the Bibliography on Education of Negroes, comprising publications from January 28 to December 1930, Background Study of Negro College Students, Rural Elementary Education Among Negroes under Gene's supervising teachers, and there's a longer list of additional publications that I can report during the 1930s that he was doing this work in the Office of Education. Okay, hit it next. However, it was Calibre's stewardship in recommending and facilitating the convening of the National Conference on Fundamental Problems in the Education of Negroes in 1934 was probably one of the most significant events of his tenure in Office of Education. Calibre personally persuaded Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Department of the Interior, to call the conference and to make the opening address. The purpose of the conference was, and I quote, to consider the special and peculiar problems involved in the education of Negroes which arise from their economic and social status. President Franklin Roosevelt's letter to the attendees provided his expectations for the conference. The letter stated, and I quote, as yet, all too small a percentage of Negro children of our country, especially in its rural sections, enjoys an adequate or equitable facilities for the education which is America's goal for every child. We have neither schools enough properly to accommodate the children who should be in attendance, nor educational offerings of the quality and variety adapted to their needs. How to meet these two fundamental requirements adequately and the ramification to which considerations of their varied aspects takes us are the problems to which this conference will devote its attention. End of quote. Secretary Ickes was a much more direct in framing the problem to be addressed by the conference. He stated, most of the schools that are provided for colored children of both elementary and high school grade, the buildings and facilities are inadequate, the courses of study are ill-adapted to the needs of the children or of our times, and the teachers are poorly prepared, overloaded, and underpaid. More than 1,000 people would attend the conference, with half coming from outside the District of Columbia. As a result of the conference, a set of proposals were adopted as fundamental to the education of Negroes. The ultimate educational objectives and ideals were in the areas of home life, vocation, citizenship, recreation, and leisure, and character. The immediate educational objectives and ideals were in the areas of availability of education, teachers and teaching, financial support, administration, and segregated schools. Each of these areas were undertaken by 14 separate committees with the assistance of Calibre and the U.S. Office of Education. Calibre worked closely with David Blose, I think it's Blose, or maybe Blose. This particular publication is just kind of a reflection of the report that they did in 1940. That basically what it did is it took a complete look back at the collection of all the data from 1930. It was the first and most substantial piece of data that they would then have to take over a longitudinal period of time. And so in terms of its value, in terms of being able to look at, got it. And that, we might make that too. She was just giving me the 5-minute sign. I said, yeah, I might make that, yeah. Okay. This one particular example was this particular report, this 1940 report, provided critically important information on African American education that had not been previously available and particularly accessible to African American educational evaluators and educational researchers. The 1940 marks the end of one and the beginning of another important decade in America, and particularly in the life and education of Negroes. It is a good time, therefore, for stock taking. The educational statistics presented in this circular afforded a measure of progress made by Negroes during the past decade, and to be able to provide a criterion by which future progress may be judged. Okay. The Plessy versus Ferguson decisions framed the time in which Calibre lived. He designed and implemented the first large-scale evaluation of African Americans in public secondary schools. As a leader in the evaluation of schooling of African Americans, he provided the most important resource of the time for education research and evaluation that revealed serious deficiencies and inequalities in Negro educational facilities. It is important that we not underestimate the critical importance of collecting and providing quantitative data to explicitly show the disparities between educational systems experienced by Black and white Americans of the 1930s. Next. James D. Anderson, while James D. Anderson in his book, his highly acclaimed, multiple awards book on education of Negroes in the South, 1865 to 1932, reported that the first evaluation of an African American education by an African American is not surprising that it was done by W.B. Du Bois. That would probably not surprise most people here. His first one was in 1900 to classify Black colleges, and we could talk a little bit more deal about those classifications. And then what is considered to be the most substantive work was done a decade later in 1910. But even though that Du Bois had done this significant work. The significant roles and contributions by Calibre, Thompson, and Jackson and others during the pre-Brown era is clearly evident to some of us. Okay. A few names to know in case you did not know. So in closing, the first African-American PhD in education with a dissertation focused on evaluation was done by Edward L. Washington, an evaluation of the Negro City Junior High School Physical Fitness Exam in 1935 at NYU. Rose Brown Butler, the first African-American woman to receive a doctorate in education from Harvard, and first with a dissertation to focus on evaluation, a critical evaluation of experimental studies of remedial reading and a report on an experiment with groups of backward readers in 1939. Reedy Jackson, who I referenced a little bit earlier, was probably the most prolific of the group that we've seen thus far, a very extensive record. And what I should probably also mention at this point, you will notice that many of these folks received their PhDs at very late in their life. I made reference that Ambrose Calibre received his doctorate in 1930, but at the age of 37. That was not unusual for them as these African Americans at PhDs receiving at much later dates. In fact, the thing that was interesting about Reedy Jackson had an extensive publication record before he received his doctorate. I mean, and had been doing large-scale evaluation work substantially. So it's just what, and the reason, and why was the reason? Well, there was now funding. You know, Rosenwald Fund, Gene's Teaching Fund, several Rockefeller, they were then given money. And remember, this is during the period of Plessy versus Ferguson. So what they were trying to do is to increase the capacity of trained and doctoral level trained people to teach at the black colleges, not the white colleges, but at the black colleges, okay? Aaron Brown also was a large-scale evaluation scholar who noted that Ralph Tyler served on his dissertation committee at the University of Chicago in 1944. He would later become the president of Fort Valley State University, another HBCU in Georgia. And Leander Boykin probably did what I consider some of the incredible work, actually, when you're talking about looking at finance across all of the southern states in terms of public schooling, public finances for schooling across all of the states in this period of time. And one of the things that I talk to my students about is that we've been analyzing, is asking them about what was the amount of effort that it required for them to collect this kind of data under those circumstances. No handheld computers, no hardcore collecting those things. Okay, all right. So whether this exclusion from our history of U.S. evaluation has been by accident or by design, we will leave for you and others to answer. Thank you.